Did you know the deadliest genocide in Africa's history wasn't caused by war or famine, but by a European king chasing wealth? It wasn't Hitler, it was King Leopold II of Belgium, and what he did in the Congo was pure horror. Between 1885 and 1908, up to 10 million Congolese people were killed, mutilated, or worked to death. And all of it was done in the name of profit, rubber profit. At the Berlin Conference, European powers divided Africa like a pie. But Leopold didn't just want a piece. He wanted the entire Congo as his personal property, not Belgium's, his. He claimed he was building schools and hospitals, but it was all a lie. What he built instead was a slave empire masked as a free state. He created fake charities and lobbied world powers for support. Even America backed him, but when the rubber boom exploded, Leopold turned violent. Entire villages were raided, men were chained and forced to meet rubber quotas. If they failed, their wives and children were held hostage or killed. Children had their hands chopped off, not as a warning, but as proof that bullets weren't wasted. His brutal army, the Force Publique, had one rule: meet quotas at all costs. Hands became currency. Whips made of hippo hide tore through skin. And while Congo bled, Leopold built palaces back in Belgium with Congo's wealth. So how did the world finally find out? A shipping clerk named Edmund Morel noticed something strange. Only guns went in and rubber came out. He raised the alarm. Then came British missionary Roger Casement, who documented the atrocities firsthand. They launched one of the first international human rights campaigns in history. And after years of pressure, Belgium took control of the Congo in 1908. But not to save lives, to save face. Leopold never apologized. He called it a civilizing mission and built statues in his own honor. And Belgium kept control of Congo until 1960. The scars. They've never left. Today, most Belgians don't learn this in school. Most history books don't go deep enough. And for many people, this chapter of history remains buried. But why do we erase African pain from the pages of colonial history? Why are some genocides remembered and others forgotten? If this shocked you, don't scroll past. Share this story. Spread the truth. Speak the names they tried to erase. Like, share, and follow, because the past isn't just history, it's the foundation of our world today.
Thank you for joining me today. I was just sitting here living the good life in Nebraska, and I thought, you know what? I think I missed a step about the herd. You know, the show I did recently about Netflix and Pornhub and all of them spending their money all around? Well, I have said the goods like sex materials, pornography, etc. routed through Amsterdam up to Belgium and into Europe. Well, I kept missing Belgium. Some of you may or may not remember, but a few years ago I started tracking these people. I tracked them from the UK to Amsterdam, where they settled in Leiden. Some of the people there left for the Mayflower, and that's where it got kind of interesting, because then I started looking into, well, who got left behind in Amsterdam, right? So, for example, FDR comes from that region on the Delano side. FDR, Delano. Yeah, the Delano side was very involved in the opium money. So I knew all that, you know, Amsterdam, but I think I was just too focused on Amsterdam, and I kept talking about Belgium as merely being a pass-through, which was a huge, huge, huge oversight. I mean, monstrous oversight, which I will be clearing up today. And of course, they also intersect with those Habsburgs. Kind of funny how they got into business around the time that they did, right? Around the time that I've been talking that they likely took over. And let's not forget Leopold and that human zoo. Let's not push these things, oh, that was so long ago. Why do you keep bringing up these old things? 1958 was when those human zoos stopped, okay? 1958 was not that long ago. So I did a little checking into, because we're going to be talking about the Congo today. I did a little checking into what's going on in the Congo since I last left a few years ago. Well, the fighting's still going on, and Paul Kagame, who's Obama's guy, in there to keep it going. The reason the fighting is continuing in the Congo, just a simple reason, is because as long as the fighting goes on, they can be extracting all of the goods out of the Congo. So the Congo has never stopped getting hit, right? So according to them, there's a group in the Congo, a rebel group called M23. Well, the letter M, flip it on the side, you got a 3. 23, you got a 5. So they're claiming that it's this rebel group in M23. Now, I don't want to suspend this forever and make you think, oh, who was M23? Well, now, really, I'm not going to go into all the details this minute, but it's like shooting fish in a barrel some days. Well, the M23 insurgency has escalated since re-emerging around 2022, capturing these cities, blah, blah, blah. Tens of civilians have been killed or displaced by fighting, and millions are internally displaced in ongoing humanitarian crisis zones. So in June 2025, the DRC and Rwanda signed a U.S. brokered peace agreement to try to end the cross-border hostilities. So they claim that M23 was not a direct signatory, but hey, it's all the same people, right? All the exact same people. Because M23 gets referred to as a proxy group. Well, we all know what proxy means, right? So it says it acts as a proxy force serving regional political and economic interests, controlling mineral zones, trade routes, and border crossings that the Congo's resources into Rwanda and international markets. So they're basically taking stuff out of the Congo through Rwanda and out into the international market. The Kigali is a place that has been completely reworked, and now it's like they speak English in Kigali. So Kigali is the point that I last left off that they are actually working in, and now it's a big cosmopolitan kind of a city. And don't forget, Kigali was the way that Obama also signed the U.S. up for those Kigali principles, which means that every U.S. citizen will get the brute force of the UN on U.S. streets. I've been talking about this for years now. All they have to do is get some conflict going in this country, and that will trigger the Kigali report. And so what that will mean, it will allow UN troops on the streets here. So, of course, Rwanda officially denies backing M23 and frames its actions as offenses or as responses to threats. So, yeah, Paul Kagame rides again. So, Paul Kagame, let's get a little update. The children in the Congo aren't doing really well, right? I can't imagine any child in the Congo is getting nighttime bed stories or attention from mom and dad. So let's take a peek at Paul Kagame's children. Last we left off, Angie Kagame, his only daughter. Yeah, she's quite in there. I think she graduated from Harvard, or I forget, one of the top elite colleges. Angie was born on 8 September 1993. Was she born in the Congo in a tent? No, of course not. She was born in Brussels, Belgium. She studied in the U.S. and holds a bachelor's degree from Smith College and a master's from Columbia University. So what's Angie up to now? Well, she's over there in Kigali, and she is over there running things. She married a guy. She has a child now. Yeah, so it looks like his kids are living the good life, right? She married a guy who graduated from the London School of Economics in 2019. Yeah, Angie's doing pretty well. She's over there in Kigali. So Angie Kagame is based in Rwanda, particularly Kigali, where she holds a government role. Now, isn't that nice? Here again, your tax dollars at work, right? So Angie's living the good life while the Congo is being ripped to shreds. In August 2023, she was appointed Deputy Executive Director in charge of Strategy and Policy Council at the Office of the President of Rwanda. Sounds like she's working for Dad. Well, anyways, just keep in mind, those Kigali principles are going to nail every American to the cross. So take this Congo stuff fairly seriously. So let's look at this Congo stuff. I think that we have been marketed into a certain belief about Belgium. You've heard of Belgian chocolates, smooth, elegant, wrapped in gold foil, the symbol of a small nation's refinement. But peel back that wrapper and you'll find something else entirely. A financial network born in blood and rubber, perfected through empire, and now disguised as bureaucracy and neutrality. Belgium sells itself as the heart of Europe, home of NATO, the European Union, and peace diplomacy. But for more than a century, it's also been the vault of Europe, a discreet corridor where money, minerals, and people move quietly across borders. From King Leopold's Congo Free State, one of the most brutal profit machines in human history, to today's diamond pipelines, sex work deregulation, and tech data havens, Belgium has mastered the art of turning exploitation into civility. While other nations bury their colonial past, Belgium built over it with marbles, lace, and chocolate. This is a story about a country smaller than Maryland, became the moral headquarters of the West and the financial bloodstream of the very systems it pretends to regulate. And now we're going to be talking about the herd of modern network of traffickers, financiers, and consultants. They found its perfect cover inside the world's most polite capital. Yes, Belgium is known as the most polite capital, while underneath lies a certain bloody past. So how did these people get over there? How'd they get started? Well, the Habsburgs. In the 15th century, much of present-day Belgium, then called the Low Countries, was ruled by the Dukes of Burgundy, who were vassals of the French crown but acted semi-independently. When Mary of Burgundy, the last Burgundian ruler, married Maximilian of Habsburg in 1477, her territories passed into the Habsburg family. This union linked the wealthy Low Countries, including Flanders, Brabant, and Antwerp, with the vast Habsburg dominions in Central Europe. Pretty big deal, I would say. The Spanish Habsburgs, 1556 to 1713. In 1556, Emperor Charles V, born in Ghent in modern Belgium, abdicated and divided his empire. His brother Ferdinand received Austria and the imperial title. His son, Philip II, received Spain, the Americas, and the Spanish Netherlands, modern Belgium and Luxembourg. Under the Spanish Habsburgs, Belgium became a Catholic stronghold during the Reformation, while the northern provinces, modern Netherlands, revolted and became Protestant. And that's how I was slipping past Belgium, because I was focused on Netherlands, but I didn't connect the dots between Netherlands and Habsburgs and Belgium. That's why research is always a key thing, right? So I didn't practice my own skill levels, and I just skipped past that part. So then they had the 80-year wars from 1568 to 1648 that split the Low Countries and made it north was independent Dutch Republic and south became Belgium, and remained under Spanish Habsburg rule as the Spanish Netherlands. Spanish control lasted until the early 1700s. Despite warfare and censorship, Flanders and Brabant remained prosperous trading and artistic regions, and Rubens Antwerp flourished. So then we have the Austrian Habsburgs, 1713 to 1794. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, ended Spanish Habsburg rule. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, awarded the Austrian Habsburgs control of the southern Netherlands. Under the Austrian Netherlands, rulers like Emperor Charles VI and Marie Theresa sought to modernize administration and revive trade. However, the enlightened absolution of Joseph II, Marie Theresa's son, who tried to curb church power and reform laws, provoked local resistance and Brabant Revolution of 1789 to 1790, briefly creating the short-lived United Belgian States. Austrian control ended when French revolutionary troops invaded in 1794. Belgium was annexed to France until Napoleon's defeat in 1815. The Habsburg centuries tied Belgium to both Catholic Europe and the Spanish-Austrian imperial system. Architect, religion, and art from this period still dominate Belgian cities. The empire's bureaucratic and multilingual legacy, French, Dutch, Latin, and later German, contributed to the country's complex linguistic and political divisions. So, I have everything you want to know about all these invasions and these wars down below, and here's how it works. Belgium sits at the intersection of three taboos: money, colonial guilt, and modern trafficking. Each one alone is dangerous. Combined, they form a zone few journalists dare to map. Belgium history is deeply tied to the Habsburg family, one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The connection began in 1477 when Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian of Habsburg. Their rich lands, including what is now Belgium, passed into Habsburg hands, joining them to an empire that stretched across Europe. Their grandson, Charles V, was born in Ghent and ruled a vast realm that included Spain, Austria, and the Low Countries. So when he gave up his throne in 1556, Belgium became part of the Spanish Habsburg regime, while the northern provinces broke away to form the Protestant Dutch Republic. For the next century and a half, the southern provinces, modern Belgium, stayed under Catholic Spanish rule, serving as a key outpost of Habsburg power. After the War of the Spanish Succession, control shifted to the Austrian branch of the family in 1713. The Austrian Habsburgs modernized the administration and supported the arts, but their reforms sparked revolts like the Brabant Revolution of 1789. French troops invaded a few years later, ending more than 3 centuries of Habsburg influence in Belgium. The Belgian royal family, the House of Leopold, is connected. And this is where it's very important, because it was all of them that really did the Congo in, right? You can't just say it was just Belgium, because Belgium was connected to the Habsburg world through marriage and shared aristocratic circles. Though it represents a different dynasty, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When Belgium gained independence in 1830, the new country needed a monarch who could balance European powers. The throne went to Leopold I, a German prince from the Coburg line, but one deeply tied to the Habsburgs through his family's long-standing alliances with Austria. Throughout the 19th century, the Belgian royal house maintained close relations with the Habsburg court in Vienna, often marrying into Habsburg or Habsburg-connected families. This helped secure Belgium's legitimacy as a Catholic, conservative monarchy at a time when much of Europe was reshaping after Napoleon's wars. In this sense, the Leopolds carried forward a Habsburg legacy of dynasty diplomacy, blending Central European royal traditions with Belgium's new national identity. From the 1400s onward, the region sat at the crossroads of trade, religion, and politics, close to the North Sea ports between France and Germany, and along the major routes connecting London, Paris, and the Rhineland. Now, who's this kind of starting to sound familiar, like trade routes, those Khazars? Well, I'll keep reading. I have more about that in a bit here. Whoever controlled Belgium effectively controlled the nerve center of Western Europe, its trade flows, its gold and textile industries, and later, its banking systems. For the Habsburgs, this wasn't just about money, it was about secrecy and leverage. The Low Countries were one of the richest areas of the world during the 16th century, full of merchant guilds, art markets, and discreet financiers. Antwerp, in particular, became a global financial hub where imperial money, church ties, and private fortunes could move quietly through networks of brokers and bankers. That pattern, wealth, secrecy, and neutrality, never really disappeared. Belgium later became home to Brussels, the capital of both NATO and the European Union, serving again as a kind of polite cover for powerful interests operating behind the scenes. The continuity is striking. The Habsburgs once ruled from castles and cathedrals. Today, influence flows from banks, consultancies, and international institutions. Both eras rely on the same principle: control the crossroads, and you control the conversation. So it's true that both the Khazar Kagaki and the Habsburg Empire rose to power by positioning themselves along crucial trade routes. But they existed in very different eras, geographics, and cultural worlds. So there isn't a direct connection between the Khazars and the Habsburgs, other than the fact that they controlled trade routes and stuff, right? So I've already talked a lot about the Khazars and all them. They say that the Habsburgs emerged in medieval Central Europe, modern Switzerland, and Austria. Their power was rooted in dynastic marriages, territorial inheritance, and imperial politics. By 1500, they ruled vast parts of Europe, including Spain, Austria, and the Low Countries of Belgium. Like the Khazars, they controlled trade crossroads, but through ports, river systems, the Rhine and the Danube, and colonial routes to the Americas and Asia. Their model was bureaucratic and religious Catholic empire, not mercantile and multi-faith like the Khazars. So both the Khazars and Habsburgs built empires where money and goods had to pass through, one between the east excuse me, okay, let me start over again. Both the Khazars and the Habsburgs built empires where money and goods had to pass through, one between the East and the Islamic world, the other between the Atlantic and continental Europe. Both also balanced powerful neighbors by staying diplomatically flexible. The Khazars between empires, the Habsburgs between church and crown, later between rival European powers. But they were separated by nearly 500 years and an entire continent. The connection is conceptual, not genealogical, a repeated historical pattern where those who control transit points or trade networks hold disproportionate influence, whether on the Volga or in Brussels. It's true that Brussels today sits at another of those crossroads where wealth and decision-making pass through. The city's position between the North seaports and the Rhine corridor, exactly where medieval Flanders once handled northern European trade, has made it a natural headquarters for the European Union, NATO, and thousands of financial or consulting firms that plan and route money across borders, and ding, ding, ding. Much of the capital moving through Belgium is perfectly legal. Corporate financing, EU programs, and logistic spending. But the same features that make Brussels efficient also make it attractive for tax arbitrage and financial secrecy. Imagine that. Modern multinationals base coordination centers there, so taking advantage of Belgium's dense treaty network, its flexible corporate tax rulings of the 1990s to 2010s, and its proximity to Luxembourg and the Netherlands. Billions in intra-company loans, licensing fees, and hedge fund transfers move through this small territory each year before being booked elsewhere. In that sense, the herd of global capital now migrates through Brussels, much as medieval caravans passed through Khazar toll posts or Habsburg custom ports. The value lies in controlling the gate, not necessarily in producing the goods. And that is key to all of these groups, right? Control that gate. You don't have to produce the goods, just control, like the psychopaths you are, how it moves, right? The historic rhyme is strategically geography. The Khazars occupied the steep bridge between the Islamic world and Northern Europe. The Habsburgs held the overland corridor between the Atlantic trade powers and Central Europe, and Brussels now anchors the legal and bureaucratic corridor through which European and transatlantic finance flows. Control of those routes, physical or regulatory, has always meant quiet influence, the ability to shape who pays, who profits, and who passes through. There are historians, economists, and investigative journalists who have drawn out connections between Belgium's geography, its financial role, and power schemes, and the elite networks in a single grand thesis. But many works come close or touch parts of that narrative. So no one is really covering the whole narrative, and I have a list of some people who have been covering the Habsburg part of it. Other people have covered some of the state archives of the Habsburg institutions. Henri Perret, one of Belgium's most famous historians, he emphasizes Belgium's middle position between the Latin and Germanic parts of Europe, and how its trade, cities, and geography drew it into wider European currents. But most of his work doesn't explore modern finance or tax havens, so yeah, but his work talks about Belgium as a crossroads in many eras. So yeah, there are some different things that have happened, but really nobody's talking about this particular money thing, right? There was a Belgian investigative journalist associated with this group called NACK, K-N-A-C-K, and the ICIJ, that group I had spoken about in the past. The ICIJ was a group that Daphne in Malta had also been a member of. So there was a Belgian investigative journalist associated with NAC and the ICIJ, and his name is Christophe Cleric. Cleric had delved into Belgium's intelligence services, offshore structures, and the role of Brussels-based institutions in tax planning. He participated in exposing tax leaks, like the LuxLeaks and Panama Papers, and spoke publicly about how Belgium's structures had been leveraged for secrecy. And he wrote something called Read My Lips. So Belgium news outlets participated in the ICIJ's leak investigations, exposing Belgian individuals and companies using offshore schemes. For example, the 2016 Panama Papers revealed that many Belgians had links to Mossack Fonseca's tax evasion structures. And more broadly, Belgium has been criticized for facilitating tax avoidance in 2016. In 2016, Belgium ranked high for tax evasion in some European comparisons. Some political commentators and left-leaning journalists have written about Belgium's role in European power and finance, framing Brussels as both symbolic and functional in EU imperial structures. For instance, pieces point out how Brussels is not just a neutral capital, but a seat of power that shapes European policy and economic flows. While many of these works cover parts of the picture, trade, institutional continuity, modern tax avoidance, Few combine them into a single narrative that connects Habsburg-era strategies to 21st century financial control. A lot of modern power structures are opaque. Journalists can't expose parts of them, but historical lines, like between Habsburg revenue systems and modern tax rulings, are harder to prove directly. There's a political risk. Tying state and elite networks across centuries is provocative, and sometimes scholars and journalists self-censor or frame things cautiously to avoid legal or political pushback. In democratic countries, the most common form of pushback isn't censorship, but litigation. If a journalist or historian connects a modern financial actor, politician, or multi-international firm to wrongdoing, even with good evidence, the subject can file defamation suits or strategic lawsuits against public participation, also called SLAPS, SLAPPS. These suits are designed not necessarily to win, but to drain the writer's resources and intimidate others from publishing similar findings. And that's exactly what happened with Daphne. They started burying her with lawsuits, right? This is really a cut and paste operation. What they did to Daphne, they're doing to people all over the world. So historians also face softer pressure. Grants, university posts, or archival access can all be influenced by the sensitivities of donors or state bodies. For instance, research on colonial atrocities in the Congo took decades to reach daylight in Belgium because archives were restricted and reputationally denial ran deep. A historian who makes bold claims about elites or enduring systems of control may find that academic journals decline to publish, or that access to primary sources quietly vanishes. Those in power have the advantage of classified data, private contracts, and closed-door decisions. Investigators have to reconstruct truth from fragments, leaks, financial filings, eyewitnesses, and patterns. This allows defenders to claim no direct proof, even when the circumstantial case forms a coherent picture. There's also cultural and psychological barriers. People are more comfortable believing corruption is an accident rather than a structure. So when someone proposes that an empire's old networks, corporate secrecy, and modern lobbying might share a lineage, many react defensively, not because it's false, but because it challenges the image of order and fairness you've been taught to trust. The truth usually does surface eventually, but it needs persistence and collective work. Hundreds of reporters across dozens of countries shared data with the Panama Papers and LuxLeaks and the Swiss secrets. Their theory was it shared data so that no single outlet or individual could be targeted easily. Unfortunately, that didn't work out so well for Daphne. Likewise, historians now reevaluate older archives with new methods, using digitized financial ledgers, correspondence, and trade maps to trace how power operated across generations. Daphne's work fit at the same geographic and structural logic that I've been tracing here. Malta, like Belgium, sits at the fault line of global finance. Tiny territory, huge flows of money, legal and tax efficiency, and political systems that can be captured by business interests. Daphne was documenting how those flows were being manipulated when she was silenced. And I did some research into these SLAPP laws. After this happened with Daphne, I don't know if it was a cause or an effect, but starting in 2024, the European Parliament and Council adapted these protective laws to protect journalists called SLAPP, S-L-A-P-P, and that just came about in 2024. So anyway, so they came up with this but EU has legally committed to making it easier or less risky for journalists and advocates to defend themselves against abusive lawsuits designed to silence them. Well, there's a lot of issues with this whole thing that really aren't worth our time for today, but just to tell you a little bit about it, Belgium's whistleblower laws. Belgium was late in adopting a full countrywide whistleblower protection framework. But as of late 2022, early 2023, it put in some new things. But yeah, they've been just skating the law. So in Belgium, whistleblowers have stronger legal shelter now than they did before, though enforcement and culture still matter. So yeah, they claim they've got enforcement, but it's really in how you can pass all the laws you want, but if nobody's going to react to them, that's how it's going to fall to the wayside, right? And I've got everything you want to know about why it didn't pass, why it passed. So anyway, so cross-border and digital cases. Much abuse happens via cross-border claims or through online publications. Cross-border, okay. Many critics argue that defining manifestly unfounded or abusive, so there's a lot of issues with that. So here's the bottom line. For journalists, researchers, and whistleblowers, the legal climate in the EU and in Belgium has recently tilted more in their favor. New protections against abusive lawsuits like those slaps and improved whistleblower laws promise safer pathways for exposing wrongdoings. But the effectiveness of these protections will depend heavily on how well individual companies implement them, how jurisdictions interpret them, and whether public institutions and media cultures respect them in practice. So, yeah, people who profit from keeping things obscure often ensure that exposing it comes at a high cost. So, yeah, I would say that I wouldn't fall for any of these tricks personally, and there was one case that I found. A well-known case is the Hans Martin Tillich case. Tillich was a journalist, was investigating the Eurostat EU fraud scandal and published reports about misuse of European funds. Belgian authorities, at the instigation of EU institutions, raided his home and office, seized documents, questioned him, and sought his sources. The European Council of Human Rights later ruled that the Belgian actions had violated his right to protect journalistic sources and awarded him damages and costs. Well, in October 2024, there were reports of preventative censorship in Belgium. 4 media outlets had articles blocked or threatened before publication concerning investigations into tax offenses by a local politician. So in 2024, there was people were talking about these people who were this local politician. So the Belgian state applied a police search to 4 journalists in an effort to identify the source of a leak. The European Court intervened, finding that the search was unjustified and disproportionate. Decisions like that push Belgium to strengthen protections for media and sources. Right. I'm sure Belgium's going to get right on that now, aren't you? So, because Belgium is still in the process of transposing the EU anti-SLAPP directive, there's no public blah blah blah. Okay, so that's where it stands. Well, anyway, so Daphne, the Maltese investigative journalist killed by a car bomb in 2017 after exposing EU-linked corruption and offshore money networks. Her death her murder was a warning to everyone inside the European media ecosystem. If you follow the money past the PR curtain, it leads straight into the core of European power. And Belgium is that core. Belgium isn't just the capital of, Brussels isn't just the capital of Belgium. It is the capital of everyone who funds journalism. EU institutions, NATO, the World Bank's offices, and hundreds of NGOs and media foundations all operate there. Many European journalists depend on grants or access from those very entities. Criticizing Belgium too harshly can mean losing credentials or funding. And then it's always by the laws that they make that define who they are, right? Just like those crazy laws about the Jews, right? Don't say anything bad about Jews or you're going to go to prison. Well, Belgium has some of the most restrictive libel and privacy laws in all of Europe. Its courts can impose crippling damages, even for reputational harm. So investigating royal finances, bank transfers, or human trafficking So investigating royal finances, bank transfers, or human trafficking cases that touch political donors can instantly become a legal trap. After Daphne's assassination, many reporters began to treat Brussels as a no-go zone for deep financial stories, fearing both legal retaliation and physical surveillance. Malta and Belgium are connected through the same offshore conduits, trusts, shell companies, and EU passport programs. But Belgium hides behind the bureaucracy rather than breaches. Because Belgium hosts NATO, the EU, and UNICEF Europe, any criticism risks being painted as anti-European or conspiratorial. The country's image as the heart of democracy doubles as a shield. It's difficult to accuse the arbiter of being an accomplice. And we have the quiet continuity. The same banking families that finance colonial trade evolved into today's private banking sector and political elite. The royal holdings, church charities, and developmental foundations all share directors with logistics, diamond, and arms export firms. The lines blur so seamlessly that tracing them becomes career suicide for most reporters. So yes, fear is part of the architecture. Belgium doesn't need to censor directly. It governs through prestige and access. A journalist doesn't have to be silenced, just excluded from the briefings, the summits, the next EU press junket. For a century, the land we now call Belgium was a patchwork of duchies, counties, and biospheres fought over by empires. It was part of the southern Netherlands, ruled successfully by Spain under the Habsburgs, then Austria, then France. When Napoleon fell, the Congress of Vienna, 1815, redrew Europe's borders to prevent another French expansion. They glued Belgium to the Netherlands under King William I of Orange, forming the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was a political experiment, a Protestant king ruling over a mostly Catholic French-speaking South, and it did not last. So by 1830, after years of tension over language, religion, and trade policy, Southern rebels revolted. They declared independence on 10 October 1830. By 1831, Leopold I, a German prince and widower of a British princess, was installed as king of the Belgians, deliberately chosen as a neutral monarch by Britain and France. Belgium became a constitutional monarchy, one designed to be inoffensive and neutral, a buffer between great powers. So Leopold reigned between 1831 to 1865. He was the founder of the Belgian monarchy. Born a German prince of Saxe-Coburg, chosen by the British and French to keep Belgium neutral between their empires. Married first a British princess, Charlotte, daughter of King George IV's brother. His reign was about building a stable constitutional state and industrial economy at home, not colonies abroad. He kept Belgium officially neutral, which later made it attractive for banks and diplomacy. And then, of course, we had Leopold II, the son, reigned from 1865 to 1909. Obsessed with giving tiny Belgium the global prestige of an empire, he personally created the Congo Free State in 1885, presenting it as a humanitarian project to civilize Africa. In reality, it became one of history's most violent resource extraction regimes. Millions of Congolese died from forced labor, mutilation, and starvation in the rubber and ivory trades. The profits flowed directly to Leopold II's private fortune, not Belgium's treasury. Only after international outrage did the Belgian parliament seize control from him in 1908, converting it into official Belgian Congo colony. So yes, after the African horrors were King Leopold II's doing, but they grew from the foundations his father built. He built a neutral state with industrial ambitions, perfectly placed between the European powers. Leopold I made Belgium legitimate. Leopold II made it rich through empire. So, Leopold II becomes king of the Belgians in 1865, inheriting a small but industrialized advanced nation. He immediately complains that Belgium is a small country with small horizons. Europe's major powers, Britain, France, Portugal, already control most of the world's colonies. But Belgium's neutrality forbids conquest, so Leopold begins plotting a private colonial venture under his own name. 1876, the philanthropy cover. Leopold convenes the Geographic Conference of Brussels, creating the International Africa Association. Publicly, it was a scientific and humanitarian society to open Africa to civilization. Privately, it was a front for terrorist claims. The IAA's flag, blue with a golden star, would later become the flag of the Congo Free State. So 1879 to 1884, secret empire building. Leopold sends Henry Morton Stanley, the Welsh-American explorer, to the Congo basin under the guise of mapping. Stanley coerces local chiefs into signing treaties, ceding land to Leopold's shell companies. He establishes outposts and transport routes for ivory and rubber extraction. So then, at the 1885 Berlin Conference, Europe legitimized his claim. At the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, the European powers, they all got together and decided. It wasn't just one group decided. All of them decided, right? They formally divided Africa. Through skillful diplomacy and bribery, Leopold gains recognition for his personal possession. The Congo Free State, an area 76 times the size of Belgium. He presents himself as a humanitarian monarch who will end the slave trade and bring Christianity. But the Congo is run as Leopold's private business, not a Belgian colony. Companies like the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company enforced quotas with terror. Villages that failed to meet rubber targets were burned. Men were shot. Women and children were taken hostage. Soldiers had to bring back severed hands to prove bullets were not wasted. Contemporary estimates suggest 10 million Congolese died from violence, disease, and starvation. Rubber and ivory profits made Leopold one of Europe's richest men. He bankrolls grand projects in Brussels and Austin, parks, palaces, and monuments still standing today. Belgian banks and industrial firms expanded globally on those profits. Meanwhile, the Congo's population collapsed. So 1903 to 1908, exposure and outrage. So he was exposed and there was outrage, and so what did they do then? Well, not very good things for the Congo, because under global outrage, Leopold is forced to hand control of the Congo to the Belgian state. So how is the Belgian state taking all this over really any better than what Leopold was doing? That's my big question, because Leopold retained much of his fortune. His heirs still keep estates funded by Congo money. Belgium keeps the mineral wealth flowing: copper, cobalt, diamonds, uranium, the same resources that would later feed Europe's industrial and nuclear power. Aftermath. I had a hard time even finding clips that talked about the history of Belgium, included the Congo. They've just conveniently just written it off, not even included. But Leopold II died in 1909, unrepentant, but celebrated at home as a builder king. His funeral procession is booed by crowds shouting "assassin," the only public reckoning he ever faced. Belgium's royal family still owns properties and foundations built from those profits. The colonial economy became the seed capital for Belgium's banking, luxury goods, and diamond industries, still centered in Brussels and Antwerp today. And of course, the Belgian royal family has consciously maintained one of the lowest public profiles in Europe, precisely because of the shadow of King Leopold II and his wealth his atrocities generated. While the British Windsors live under the bright lights of spectacle and gossip, the Belgians have chosen quiet continuity. The royal family no one talks about, but with immense symbolic power. Unlike the Windsors, whose empire was public and global, the Belgian monarch's empire, the Congo Free State, was personal, secretive, and brutal. After Leopold II's death in 1909, the monarchy's survival depended on erasing him from collective memory. So the palace and parliament quietly donated many of Leopold's assets to the state, rebranding them as national heritage. Censorship discussion of the Congo's death toll in schools and textbooks for decades has been censored, promoting a myth of Belgium as a humanitarian colonial power bringing progress to Africa. So, Belgian kings don't dominate headlines, they blend into bureaucracy. They serve more like ceremonial mediators than global personalities. Since Belgium's independence, the country has been fragile, split between Dutch-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia. The king's main job has been to hold the country together. So I have it all down below, but basically the royal family retains private estates built with Congo money, notably the Royal Trust, a vast property network including castles, forests, and coastal villas. Much of this wealth was shielded through foundations created by Leopold II to evade state seizure. The monarchy also receives annual state funding. They always have their hands out, don't they? But its assets holding remain largely unexamined. In short, the family is rich, just discreet. So why the media stays polite? Belgium's press culture is cautious. Libel laws are severe, and royal criticism is traditionally taboo. Moreover, because Brussels houses the EU and NATO, Belgium's media scene is heavily intertwined with diplomatic decorum. Scandal sells in London tabloids. In Brussels, it risks destabilizing a delicate political balance. The modern image from empire to mediation, the current palace carefully associates itself with humanitarian causes, Africa developmental missions, interfaith dialogue, and child welfare. These are moral inversions of Leopold II's legacy, the palace's quiet attempt at atonement without ever admitting guilt. So Belgian royals survived by kind of erasing themselves. They inherited a fortune built on silence and kept power by perfecting it. While Britain exported its royalty as entertainment, Belgium internalized its monarchy as a mechanism of national amnesia. So Belgium didn't choose to leave the Congo. It was forced out by history, pressure, and rebellion. But that wasn't good enough. They were still able to hang around until the 1960s. Belgium, the country, the people who took over the stuff, right? They even did they did all those horrible human zoos. Those horrible human zoos. That went on until 1959. I don't call that long ago personally. So, anyway, so yeah, then there was the African independence wave, 1957 to 1960. So yeah, there was a Leopold riot in 1959. But yeah, basically, in 1960, the Republic of the Congo is declared independent. The new Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, delivers a fiery speech condemning Belgian exploitation, while King Baudouin, which was Leopold II's great-nephew, praises Leopold II as a civilizer. It was one of the most electrifying confrontations in decolonizing history. Belgian officials were humiliated on global television. Within a week, the army mutinied. Belgian officials fled. The mineral-rich Katagan province seceded, supported by Belgian mining efforts and Western intelligence agencies. So, of course, they had to kill Lumumba, right, in 1961. The U.S., Belgium, and their allies feared Lumumba might align with the Soviet Union. Declassified Belgian and CIA documents later confirmed that Belgian ministers approved plans to eliminate Lumumba. He was captured, tortured, and executed in Katanga in January 1961, with Belgian officials present. His body was dissolved in acid. Belgium later expressed moral responsibility, but never criminal liability. So by 1965, Joseph Mobutu, an army officer trained by the Belgians and backed by the CIA, seized power. He renamed the country Zaire and ruled as a pro-Western dictator for 32 years. Belgian companies kept mining. Brussels kept embassies and aid programs. The economic flows continued, just the faces all changed. So Belgium officially left the Congo in 1960, but its economic grip persisted for decades. The diamond trade in Antwerp still relies heavily on Congolese and Angola stones. Congolese mineral power, Western tech, and defense industries. The colonial infrastructure, Catholic missions, Belgian banks, extraction companies, quietly adopted into development partnerships. So Belgium didn't lose Congo through reform, it was lost through revolt, panic, and assassinations. What was supposed to be a 30-year transition happened in 6 months. The empire's mast cracked too fast to repair it. So they reinvented themselves from empire to Europe's moral capital. So when the Congo fell away in 1960, Belgium's political class faced existential crisis. The country had lost 50% of its overseas wealth base, tens of thousands of colonial jobs, and its global influence overnight. But it still had something priceless, a neutral image and deep financial networks. While Britain wrestled with imperial nostalgia, Belgium turned inward, asking not how do we rebuild empire, but how do we manage the new world that empire left behind. And then, of course, NATO moves to Brussels 1967 after France expelled NATO's headquarters from Paris in 1966. Belgium offered to host it. Brussels became NATO's new home in 1967. It was a masterstroke. It brought U.S. military funding and prestige. It recast Belgium as a trusted, neutral mediator in the Cold War. It allowed its capital to sit literally between Washington and Moscow, politically and geographically. Belgium had found its new empire, bureaucracy. 1958 to 1970s, the European project. Even before NATO, Belgium had already positioned itself as a center of the new European dream. Belgium was a founding member of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and the Treaty of Rome, 1957. Also, the European Economic Community, or EEF, and later the European Union, headquartered in Brussels. Brussels' identity shifted from colonial capital to continental capital. The symbolism was perfect, a small, neutral, multilingual country hosting Europe's unification, far less threatening than Paris or Berlin. 1970s to 1990s, the golden age of diplomacy and quiet money. Belgium turned moral neutrality into an export program. The old colonial elites adapted. Former Congo administrators became diplomats, bankers, and EU technocrats. Belgian law firms and logistics companies became conduits for offshore capital, discreet, unregulated, but protected by EU legitimacy. Antwerp's diamond trade expanded under ethical sourcing rhetoric while laundering stones from Africa's conflict zones. Charities, aid agencies, and Catholic missions became the new face of influence in Africa, soft power instead of colonial power. In short, it was the exact same networks with new logos. And then we get into the eras of the 1990s, the Dutroux shock and the moral reboot. The Marc Dutroux case in 1996, the kidnapping, torture, and murder of children shattered Belgium's self-image. Millions marched in protest. Institutions were accused of complicity or cover-ups. The state responded by doubling down on its humanitarian branding. Belgium promoted itself internationally as a champion of human rights and anti-trafficking policy. The royal family began publicly supporting children's charities. Brussels hosted EU justice and human rights summits. It was a moral reset that also helped bury the deeper economic continuities, colonial wealth, diamond laundering, and financial opacity. The 2000s to 2020s, the bureaucratic empire. By the 21st century, Belgium's global image was secure. They had the NATO headquarters. They had the EU Commission and Parliament. They had the World Customs Organization. They had EU control, Interpol's European offices. They had the SWIFT banking system. In effect, Brussels became the administrative brain of Western capitalism, a safe home for decisions made by everyone else's empires. But this neutrality comes with a paradox. Belgium doesn't just host global power, it filters it. Almost all major flows, from trade regulations to military logistics to financial compliance, now run through Brussels. It's an empire without soldiers, built on signatures, laws, and data centers. So, I will tell you a short story here about what I think about NATO. I stopped uploading to YouTube. I don't know, I recorded it all, but it was around 2021, right after this whole thing got going. And I decided that the best position for me to be in would be to just focus on my podcast. Because up until, well, no one is really in charge of podcasts, okay? That's how it kind of played out. And I've had my podcast for over 8 years. So I decided around that time frame that it was a much better position to stop uploading to YouTube and not have to go through all the strikes and all the suppression, all stuff there. I decided that based on no real strong regulations of podcasts, that it would be better if I just went over and buried myself in my podcast and went from there. Well, I didn't realize that podcasts are also totally infiltrated, and I will only tell you part of the story. So I get moved over just doing my podcast, and I'm humming along, right? Now, I used to have help to upload my podcast, because in order for your podcast to share with other people, you have to upload your podcast to a host server. Well, because of not having any funding and being on my own, I was forced into having to learn how to do that step, because up until, I don't know, the first 5 or 6 years, I had a show manager and people that did these things, right? So I had to learn that step of how to upload my files. Well, I started noticing things because I didn't know what I was doing, so I was paying attention. So when I would upload a file, when you upload a file, you can see on this map where your downloads are coming from, right? Well, I started seeing downloads coming from specific places, and it kept happening, kept happening, kept happening. And 2 of the places were Brussels and Virginia. So I went on a tear, and I said something online about that I'd noticed this, right? Well, almost immediately they took my bait and they completely reorganized things. So that's effort number 1. So I had no clue that I was being monitored on my podcast. But I also had no clue that because I chose this work to identify psychopaths in this research, well, NATO has been involved in the definition of what a psychopath is. So I don't know. Did they pick me out of the crowd? Because when I started, I was in Silicon Valley after a horrific event with Intel when they decided to steal my work. I decided to fight back. After the lawsuit, I had determined that the majority of people running Silicon Valley were indeed psychopaths, and then I left the area and continued on with my work, because my first contact was with Robert Hare, the world's leading psychopath expert, and I found him so interesting, let's put it this way, to deal with. And he came out of NATO. It says it right there. He was attending a NATO meeting, but I'll get more into that later. So was it my work with psychopaths that got me under the focus of NATO, or am I just imagining all this stuff? I don't really know. But ever since then, I've exposed what they're doing to all of us. We're now in what I would consider a silent war. They don't have to beat down our doors to get to us if we're reporting the truth. What they do is quite simple. They hook up something to your smart meter, or they're creating dirty electricity, so it is being pumped into our home. So if you're considered a somebody they want to, let's say, get rid of, you just get a more severe treatment, right? They don't really need to lock us up anymore. So that was how I engaged with NATO, and that's why quite often I will say, "Good morning, Brussels, good morning, NATO," because I don't know who in the heck they are, but they seem to be interested in my work, and that is all that I'm going to say right now. But they do tend to take the bait, because after not uploading to YouTube for a few years, and probably 3 years, about a year ago, I kicked into gear and I got about 60 files converted. So I went on this thing and I uploaded about 50 or 60 shows to YouTube. Well, on purpose, I didn't say anything about it on my podcast until I was all done. I just casually mentioned, oh yeah, I was over on YouTube this last month and I uploaded a bunch of shows over there. And that's all I really said, right? Well, the very next day, I think it was you, NATO, the very next day, I started getting strikes on my account. Yeah, and it was interesting which shows they didn't want me talking about. Yeah, they didn't like shows about them chasing children through the woods. They didn't like shows about them drinking children's blood. So yeah, they specifically had to go and target shows that they could give me strikes for to take it down. And I believe that was NATO. So that's all I'm going to disclose. So that has been my personal interaction with NATO. And obviously, working in Silicon Valley, I had interaction with people who I now consider quite questionable, right? Because Silicon Valley was started by the intelligence community. So anyway, so here's the final irony as far as Belgium. So today, Belgium promotes ethical AI, substantiated mining, and humanitarian logistics. Yet much of the world's cobalt, essential for EV batteries and data servers, still comes from the Congo, often through Belgian companies. Now, can you explain how that's working out? Well, yeah, because they have declared war in the Congo to keep the goods flowing, and they have set up Kigali, excuse me, they set up Kigali to be an international center, and flowing out of Kigali is all of the stuff they're looting out of the Congo right now. Full circle, right? So when Belgium lost the Congo, it didn't lose its power, it changed its format. It went from extracting resources to extracting legitimacy, from owning colonies to hosting empires, from rubber and ivory to data and policy. Brussels became the world's polite middleman, the place where exploitation puts on a suit. So, anyhow, I've talked about all of this, and I'm not going to go into it all today about all this money shifting, and I will cover the parts of it that I didn't cover before. The modern money routes from Amsterdam's decline to Belgium's quiet corridor. The shift from Amsterdam. During the 1990s, throughout, Amsterdam was a preferred European playground for both capital and vice. Loose trade laws, liberal sex districts, and tolerant banking rules made it ideal for laundering both money and reputation. But after the 2008 financial crisis, the Netherlands came under pressure from its OECD and EU regulators to tighten banking transparency and anti-trafficking oversight. By the mid-2010s, new compliance rules on shell companies and prostitution zones were forcing the gray economy to move. The networks that once ran money and bodies through Amsterdam, brokers, logistics, operators, fake freight firms, didn't disappear. They migrated south. Belgium offered the same geographic convenience, but none of the moral glare it already had. The Antwerp Diamond District, a centuries-old enclave where billions move each year in untraceable stones. A bilingual legal system full of jurisdictional loopholes. A single case can toggle between French and Walloon courts. EU immunity zones around Brussels institutions where investigators face complex international boundaries. And most important, the NATO shield, constant diplomatic cover, security exemptions, and a high concentration of intelligence-linked contractors. In short, Belgium was already an administrative safe haven. All that changed after 2010 was what flowed through it. The Antwerp engine, diamonds, data, and dual books. Antwerp's diamond trade remained the most opaque corner of the Western economy. Rough stones from Congo, Angola, and Sierra Leone passed through intermediaries in Dubai or India before landing in Belgian vaults. From there, they could be recut, regraded, and re-exported as ethical. When EU regulators finally began tightening controls on cash transactions in luxury goods, the market simply pivoted to digital assets and logistical credits. Today, the same Antwerp brokers who once moved diamonds now broker GPU imports, rare earth shipments, and crypto-backed trade credits, all conveniently denominated through Belgian banks. Data is the new diamond, and Belgium already knew how to polish that stone. I'm going to take a break here. I'll be back in a bit. Okay, let me pick up here. The Brussels, the bureaucratic firewall. Meanwhile, Brussels turned its institutional weight into a shield. Between 2014 and 2022, dozens of private-public partnerships emerged under EU funding patterns for cybersecurity, human rights, and green tech. Many were legitimate. Some quietly channeled funds into shell consultancies and NGO fronts that served as laundering nodes for lobbying money and research grants. Because NATO and EU facilities operate under extraterritorial agreements, investigative access is murky. The result is a layered opacity, the appearance of oversight, but none of the risk. So how did this get root? Well, as Amsterdam's red light district shrank under public scrutiny, the organized herd, the trafficking networks, adapted. They re-registered operations in Belgium, taking advantage of the 2022 discrimination of sex work. Brussels and Antwerp became new hubs. Legal ambiguity meant traffickers could call themselves employment agencies. Cross-border movement from the Netherlands, France, and Germany increased, perfectly aligned with Schengen open border policy. Belgium's worker rights framing made enforcement nearly impossible. The same state that hosts the EU's anti-trafficking office now provides the safest operating zone for traffickers. Well, this shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, really, all the U.S. military bases are located around the trafficking routes, right? So NATO is over there getting all the trafficking going, and according to me, with the Romanians, right? They're over there. NATO is over there running things. Do you think that anybody slips into Romania under NATO's watch and sets up their own shop? I kind of doubt it. I think they have plans for people who try to go against them, just like they have plans for people like myself, right? So overlay all of this with NATO's footprint, procurement hubs, IT contractors, and logistics corridors running directly through Belgium. Those contracts create an ecosystem of private security, data hosting, and construction, where subcontractors can quietly commingle civilian and defense funds. It's a dual-use economy, officially about infrastructure modernization, but functioning as a laundromat for global capital. And because Belgium's neutrality and alliance hosting makes it diplomatically untouchable, almost no one questions it. So, while observers talk about European tax havens, they name Ireland, Malta, and Luxembourg. Those are satellites, convenient registration points. But the actual flow, the coordination, lobbying, and intelligence screening compliance happens through Brussels and Antwerp. Belgium is a clearinghouse, the middle layer that connects legal money to its shadow twin. So today's herd, the same pattern of opportunities of operators that I've been tracing, isn't a single cartel. It's a systematic migration of capital, labor, and logistics that follows weak regulation and strong prestige. When one country tightens the rules, the herd simply moves to the next polite jurisdiction. And Belgium, with its NATO flag and humanitarian smile, become the perfect pasture. By the 2020s, Belgium had evolved into a post-colonial empire of circulation. Diamonds became data. Rubber and ivory became lithium and GPUs. Human labor became worker mobility. The colony became the capital. Everything changed except who controls the flow. So yeah, I've got all the list down below of what they went through all these things because Belgium's post-colonial image makeover, chocolates, diamonds, lace, and beer was not accidental. It emerged as a strategic shift from empire to charm, designed to override the memory of King Leopold II's atrocities in the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908, and to stabilize Belgium's economy after the loss of its colonies. From atrocities to affluence, Belgium's image reconstruction. A handful of historians, investigative reporters, and development economists have connected Belgium's colonial future to a modern luxury brand and finance image, yet there has never been one mainstream expose that ties the Congo rubber money, Antwerp diamonds, and the Brussels power shift into a single continuous story. Yeah, they started with some history. I've already explained all this. They do in segments, right? Well, if you're going to do in segments, you miss a lot of stuff, right? So the chocolate and diamonds laundering frame, the 2000s to today. There was a book called King Leopold's Ghost in 1998, reignited public awareness of Leopold's brutality and briefly noted that Congo profits funded Brussels boulevards and palaces. He didn't track how coca and diamond branding replaced empire, but his sources inspired labor work. So yeah, a few people have talked about the money laundering. One guy did a book, Matthew Stannard, Selling the Congo, shows how Belgium built a colonial public relations industry from 1908 onward. They had world fairs, chocolate ads, and royal imagery, explicitly to override Leopold's crimes. So yeah, they came up with these chocolates and stuff, seriously. So there have been a few, and I have them all down below, so the pieces of the puzzle that still exist. Human rights reporters have talked about Congo atrocities. Business journalists have talked about mining and diamond finance. Cultural historians have talked about chocolate and branding. But no single mainstream outlet has yet produced a full spectrum money genealogy of how colonial extraction morphed into Belgium's modern luxury and bureaucratic economy. Tracing the money genealogy touches several powerful pressure points at once. The royal family and state legacy. Leopold II's personal wealth was only partially absorbed by the state in 1906. Some of it seeded charitable foundations and real estate portfolios that still operate under royal or quasi-public control. Opening those ledgers would require cooperation from the monarchy and from Belgian banks with century-old confidentiality laws. There's the Belgian banking and corporate continuity. The same holding groups that managed Congo's concession companies evolved into today's industries and financial giants. Linking colonial profits to present shareholding structures means piercing corporate archives that are legally private and politically sensitive. Then we have the diamond and chocolate sectors. Antwerp's diamond district is one of the most secretive commodity hubs on earth. Its self-regulation charter shields client data. The cocoa trade ties into multinationals headquartered in the EU, many with philanthropic branding. A journalist exposing their colonial capital roots risks coordinated legal retaliation. Then there's the NATO and the EU optics. Brussels markets itself as the capital of Europe, hosting both NATO and the European Commission. A narrative that the city's wealth flows from colonial extraction and still benefits from laundered resources profits undermines that image of ethical governance. diplomatic pressure, not just corporate, would surface. Legal risk and source protection. Belgium and anti-defamation statutes favor institutions. Publishing bank data or naming companies without judicial or backing can draw criminals as well as civil charges. Investigators working in this space often rely on leaks, making them vulnerable to surveillance or injunctions. So it's still worth looking into all of this because the Congo atrocities were well known. The economic beneficiaries are not that well known. It's important to understand how heritage industries were capitalized and explains current EU policies on diamonds, tax havens, and even developmental aid. The same government that hosts human rights summits profits from those historical pipelines. After Leopold's personal Congo Free State collapsed under public outrage in 1908, Belgium didn't confiscate the fortune. It reclassified it. The money was civilized through trusts, endowments, holding companies, and art patronage. What had been blood money became national developmental capital. When the Belgian state took over the Congo from Leopold, the deal protected his assets. Wasn't that convenient? He kept roughly half his fortune, transferred the rest into foundations and public works, museums, parks, and buildings in Brussels and Ostend. Those monuments still stand today, literally stonewashing of colonial profits. The corporations that had administered the Congo concessions were not dissolved. They were folded into Belgian holding companies, like the Société Générale de Belgique, which became the country's dominant financial institution for most of the 20th century. So the same men who oversaw forced labor became board members of developmental companies. And it's kind of hard to get information because Belgium's colonial and royal archives remain among the most restricted in Europe. Many colonial company records are private property and stored under bank confidentiality. The royal archives are accessible only with written permission from the palace. Even the African Museum in Terneville, once colonial propaganda showcase, took until 2018 to begin decolonizing its exhibits. Yet its financial documentation is still opaque as of today. Researchers who tried to follow the money trail from Congo to post-war corporate networks have repeatedly hit closed doors. By the mid-20th century, Belgium had perfected the trick of laundering history through taste. Chocolate framed Congo's cocoa as craft, not coercion. Diamonds turned blood minerals into luxury. Beer, lace, and surrealist art completed the harmless bourgeois image in the public imagination. The country of severed hands became the land of pralines and Mergot. The European cloak, Brussels' later roles hosting NATO since 1967 and the European Union since the 1950s, locked the new identity into place. These institutions projected legality, diplomacy, and Western moral order. Once Brussels was the administrative capital of the free world, no one wanted to look too closely at why it was already so wealthy and well built. In effect, the imperial past was absorbed in the architecture of European legitimacy. So when governments control archives, endowments, and the public educational curriculum, they don't need to erase, they simply omit. This entire thing has been a game of omission, right? Belgian school books only began to mention Leopold's atrocities in the 1990s. Even now, economic history courses treat the colonial era as industrial expansion, not mass theft. The moral scandal has been acknowledged, but the economic mechanism who got rich, who stayed rich, remains taboo. This is how ruling classes survive scandal. They transmute moral crimes into fiscal assets. They transfer those assets into neutral institutions. They rebrand the result as culture. Belgium did it first and best, turning atrocity into heritage, profits into pralines and chocolates, extraction into diplomacy. And because the EU and NATO grew around the rebranded capital, the concealment became structural. The burying wasn't only literal, it was systematic, anesthesic, and institutional. Belgium didn't just hide the past, it repurposed it so effectively that even many Belgians today have no sense of how directly their modern prosperity traces to a colonial crime scene. So, what was the financial camouflage? Well, Leopold II's Congo Free State was technically his personal property, not the Belgian nation's. When international outrage forced him to cede it, he turned the liquidation into a kind of state buyout. The Belgian government took the territory and its liabilities. The king and his consortium kept the profits. Those funds, estimated in today's terms at billions of dollars, they seeded real estate trusts and infrastructure projects that still yield rents to royal or aristocratic holdings. They still yield investments, and unions which became the anchors of Belgium's industrial financial system. Once those companies were folded into broader European investment networks after World War II, the colonial source of the capital was practically untraceable. The same money built Brussels' monumental core, the Royal Galleries, the Palace of Justice, and the African Museum. Publicly, these were framed as proof of Belgium's enlightenment, privacy. They were the concrete form of Congo's rubber and ivory profits. Chocolate, lace, beer, and surrealism in high design later replaced colonial imagery as Belgium's export identity. The shift was deliberate, a rebranding of national pride from empire to artistry. So for nearly a century, Belgian archives treated the colonial era as a private matter. The royal archives remained subject to palace approval. Most corporate records from the Congo period are still closed today. University funding historically flowed from the same foundations built on Leopold's wealth, which naturally shaped what questions could be asked. Until the 1990s, school textbooks described the Congo project as a civilizing mission. After the Second World War, Brussels became host to the European Economic Community and later NATO. That turned the city into a symbolic capital of the democratic West. Once the world's diplomatic headquarters sat atop the old colonial wealth, the notion that Belgium might be a laundering center for imperial capital was diplomatically inconvenient, so it disappeared from polite discussion. Even today, the pattern persists. Antwerp's diamond industry, originally structured around colonial concessions in Congo and South Africa, remains one of the world's most opaque commodity markets. Brussels' banking secrecy laws long made Belgium a mini Luxembourg for old money families. Developmental aid and corporate responsibility programs now function as moral cover for the same networks that once extracted raw resources. Belgium mastered a kind of moral inversion. The country that oversaw one of the worst colonial atrocities in human history now brands itself as Europe's conscience. Museums host human rights exhibits in halls financed by blood rubber. EU officials draft transparency directives from buildings paid for by the most profitable secrecy operations of the 19th century. So yes, they worked very hard to bury it, but not by shredding files alone. They buried it under architecture, bureaucracy, and chocolate wrappers. They built a modern liberal state on top of a moral crater and paved it over with civility. You can't enjoy inherited opulence if everyone can see the bones beneath it. Leopold's Congo Free State was not just a tragedy, it was an economic engine that generated staggering private returns. The horror was systematic, bureaucratic, and profitable. Once you know how vast the plunder was, you see why generations of elites spend the next century turning it invisible. Leopold's regime extracted rubber and ivory through forced labor so brutal the whole regions were depopulated. Modern demographic reconstructions estimate that 10 million Congolese deaths from murder, starvation, disease, and collapse of social structures. Yet during those same decades, Belgium's GDP and royal revenues surged. Leopold's personal profit is estimated at 1 to 1.5 billion in today's dollars per year at the peak of the rubber boom from 1903 to 1906. He built palaces in Brussels, Ostend, and Laeken, endowed civil monuments, purchased art collections, and accumulated European real estate from Nice to the Riviera, all financed by the Congo. When international outrage finally forced Leopold to hand the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908, the transfer was crafted to preserve wealth. The king's private companies were re-registered as Belgian firms. Concessionary trusts kept their mining and plantation rights. The Crown and its associates received indemnities for lost investments. In effect, the loot was nationalized, not restituted. That money built the ministries, parks, and mansions that still symbolize Belgian civility today. Once the atrocities became undeniable, the state needed a narrative that allowed Belgians to look at their wealth without shame. So they did three things. They shifted the focus from aesthetics, Belgian craftsmanship, European refinement. They sanitized the story. Congo became a tale of exploitation, not extraction. They transferred guilt to the past. Leopold became a misguided monarch, not a structural symptom. By the mid-20th century, the descendants of the colonial class were investment bankers, museum trustees, and NATO bureaucrats. Their inherited capital, filtered through holding companies, had lost its odor. To confront that history honestly would mean demanding restitution from families and firms still holding colonial assets. It would mean to re-examine Belgium's own legitimacy as a neutral humanitarian hub, accepting that the European project was built with the proceeds of racial terror. That's why the mansions still gleam, the chocolates still sell, and the museums still speak in euphemisms. The wealth never vanished, it simply changed its costume. The marble, lace, and pralines of Belgium are not separate from Leopold's Congo. They are its afterlife, polished and sweetened for export. So Belgium's transformation from one of Europe's most brutal colonial powers to one of its most trusted, neutral humanitarian hubs is one of the most successful image rehabilitations in modern history. And Belgium's not alone. There's been a few other ones. In the rebranding, Belgium then hosted the League of Nations and NATO. They marketed itself as the heart of Europe. They shifted exports from rubber and ivory to diamonds, chocolates, and diplomacy. And the result was Brussels became synonymous with bureaucracy, not brutality, the polite capital of global governance. So they banking, the Nazis rebranding, they did all that. Sweden, from arms exporter to humanitarian superpower. Sweden's original sin was slave trade, weapons exports, and early industrial ties to Nazi Germany. And they rebranded themselves, championed as UN peacekeeping and global developmental aid, branded itself through the Nobel Peace Prize, IKEA minimalization, and gender equality. So Swedish neutrality became shorthand for moral authority, even as Bofors guns armed conflicts from Asia to Africa. And of course, the Netherlands went from slave trade to social liberation. Original sin, the Netherlands was one of the largest slave traders in history. Interesting, huh? With colonies across Asia and the Caribbean. How'd they rebrand? Well, after decolonization, they pivoted to global human rights and drug policy liberalism. Amsterdam's image became tolerance, bicycles, and canals. A progressive paradise image that masked centuries of violent trade and continuing dominance of Dutch multinationals like Shell and Unilever, rooted in empire profits. Of course, the United Kingdom went through another empire to NGO empire. The United Kingdom, the original sin, the largest colonial system in world history. How'd they rebrand? Well, after 1945, reinventing itself as a global arbiter of law, finance, and aid. London became headquarters for charities, think tanks, and human rights foundations, many funded by the same families who once ran the colonies. What was the result? Well, Britain's soft power shifted from gunboats to Oxford accents, moral empire instead of territorial empire. And of course, there was France. They originally had the brutal colonial war in Algeria, Indochina, and Africa. They were complicit in Rwanda's 1994 genocide. Well, they rebranded themselves through cultural diplomacy, through the Francophile, UNESCO, and humanitarian rhetoric. They maintained vast influence in West Africa through the CFA franc and military bases, and they were rebranded as anti-terror missions. And so they remain imperial leverage under the flag of enlightenment. And also Denmark and Norway got rebranded. Yeah, a lot of these countries have been rebranded because just to avoid their past. And sadly, most people don't look to see what they were before. So while Britain exported its soft power and Switzerland banked it, Belgium built a literal capital of moral legitimacy, Brussels, right on top of its colonial loot. So yeah, and they got there by inviting that German prince over to run Brussels, right? So, well, the dots seem to collect pretty clearly to me, and I have some of these other cases listed down below if you want to read more of them. So yeah, they basically just shifted the money around, right? At the same time, Brussels positioned itself as an administrative capital, the perfect neutral host for new European institutions. So yeah, they have a whole history of this kind of stuff. And this also ties in with all of these rape cases, child rape cases, where they all get going. Well, Brussels, right? Let me put this on hold for a second here. And this is interesting. The U.S. supplies the bulk of spending and weaponry in the U.S. role, but it doesn't control every lever. European states use NATO to share the cost of deference, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, that's not that interesting. But anyway, so I have more than I ever wanted to know about NATO here, but NATO wasn't there first. It arrived in 1967, nearly a century after Brussels, Feist, and financial networks were established. But yes, NATO made the system stronger by adding military secrecy, foreign immunity, and elite transscience. It turned Brussels into the perfect convergence point for political power, financial flow, and moral invisibility. The city that once ruled Africa by decree now quietly manages the West's wars and its markets and keeps both off the books. So, so as far as the modern trafficking, So was Brussels always the hub in the modern trafficking sense? Probably not, because early prostitution in Brussels was local, regulated, and municipal. It did not in the late 19th or 20th century function as a major conduit in transnational trafficking the way we see it now. But it always had the necessary elements: a visible physical infrastructure, streets, windows, and brothels, proximity to transit lines, railway stations, and commerce, legal regulatory ambiguity over third-party roles. As trafficking networks expanded with globalization, migration, digital communications, and financial opacity, Brussels was naturally positioned to morph from local red light mode to regional hub. So basically, Brussels was in on the prostitution thing early on, and that was how Amsterdam flipped their switch by agreeing for prostitution. But Brussels was there first. 1830 to 1880s, they had regulated prostitution under the monarchy. Prostitution was tolerated and municipally regulated under public health codes. So then in 1880-81, they had the white slave trade, scandal. An international uproar erupted when more than 40 underage English girls were discovered working in Brussels brothels, trafficked under false job prompts. Well, that's not looking good. So yeah, they had incidents early on. 1900 to 1945. Prostitution continued under multiple regulations. Belgium, Central Art, yeah. So that's how they slid it into, by that same deal they did in Amsterdam with the prostitution. So I wanted to take a look at how this all integrates with all these other corruptions, right? Because the 1970s to the 1990s is a time frame that I've been looking at. 1970s to 1980s, organized networks and window prostitution. Window prostitution zone solidified in the different areas of Amsterdam. Migrant women from Southern and Eastern Europe became the norm. Simultaneously, Antwerp's port enabled discrete cross-border flows of people and goods. Then in the 1990s, we had the Dutroux affair, which was 1996. Marc Dutroux' arrest exposed systematic failings in policing, judicial cooperation, and possible elite complicity. Investigators suspected wider networks tied to pornography, corruption, and trafficking, but leads were curtailed. Then, of course, they called the White March when the public outrage demanded reform. So institutions focused on procedural image and repair rather than systematic crackdown. So basically, what happened was that there was all the outrage over the Marc Dutroux case. Well, where'd that outrage go? Well, it went into weakening things, not strengthening them. So, excuse me, they had this thing called the 1995 to 2004, the Schengen and EU enlargement. Free movement of people eroded internal border checks. New member states from Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria supplied the bulk of vulnerable migrants. Brussels became a transit and destination hub. Easy transport, multiple cover languages, and EU legal shields. In the 2000s, there were escort agencies and online recruitment, Craigslist-style sites, then dedicated adult platforms, replaced traditional pimps with digital managers. These entities incorporated in Belgium or nearby Luxembourg for legal protection, using local addresses near Brussels for legitimacy. Yeah, and then they had the crime reduction things. They said, oh, we're going to stop all this crime stuff. It all leads up to the exact same trap. So, in June 2022, sex work was fully decriminalized. Belgium became the first EU nation to remove prostitution from its penal code. Workers could register as self-employed and pay taxes. Trafficking and coercion remained crimes, but required proof of control, not just profit. So traffickers exploited the gray zone by posing as business managers or room lessers. Traffickers from the Netherlands, where red light restrictions increased, relocated to Belgium districts, citing more freedom. In 2023 to present, centralization of the European network. Brussels and Antwerp form the operational core, housing, logistics, and distribution. Luxembourg, Malta, Ireland, and Cyprus act as legal financial satellites. Recruitment remains Eastern European, while digital infrastructure routes through Belgian ISPs and EU data centers. EU's 2024 trafficking report again lists Belgium as both destination and transit country. Investigators cite prostitution carousels, victims rotating among cities weekly to avoid residency detection. 2024 to 2025 policy paradox. Even as Belgium celebrates worker protection, NGOs report declining prosecutions and rising exploitation. Brussels' long reputation for tolerance, neutrality, and bureaucracy have become its camouflage. To the casual visitor, it's still the city of chocolates and diplomacy beneath the veneer. It is Europeans' logistical capital for organized vice, hiding in plain sight. Brussels didn't suddenly become operational, it always was. What changed was scale and timing. In the 19th century, they regulated vice. The 20th century, they tolerated vice. 21st century, they bureaucratized vice. Each legal evolution expanded gray space. By coupling EU institutions, global migration, and financial opacity, Belgium turned a centuries-old local economy into the epicenter of Europe's trafficking infrastructure, all while projecting civility, commerce, and chocolates. And of course, don't forget those delicious Belgian butter cookies. We're trained to associate Belgium with neutrality, chocolates, lace, and diplomacy, but scratch that veneer and a very different image appears. The country's wealth and global influence was built on one of the bloodiest colonial systems in history. Once you connect King Leopold II's Congo to modern trafficking and financial opacity, the shock turns into grim continuity. So yeah, it set off with the colonial blueprint. King Leopold personally owned the Congo as a private estate. Profits financed Brussels' grand architecture, royal galleries, public parks, even museums that still display colonial spoils. While international outrage grew after the 1904 report, Leopold handed the Congo to the Belgian state, but the financial networks and mentality of exploitation remained. The colonial administration and banks that managed rubber, mining, and shipping transitioned seamlessly into European finance. Brussels became a hub for chartered companies and developmental banks operating throughout Africa and later Asia. The same bureaucratic logic that once counted rubber quotas now manages supply chains, commodities, and by extension, people. Belgium's colonial cruelty was always framed as civilization and progress. That's called moral inversion. Violence presented as virtue set a cultural precedent, bureaucracy as a veil for exploitation. You can trace the same tone today in the language around sex work regulation, harm reduction, and worker empowerment. Each reform sounds humane while quietly protecting the economic engines underneath. So yeah, understanding Leopold's Congo makes modern Belgium less of an anomaly and more of an evolution. The state of Belgium learned how to extract value without visible brutality through paperwork, permits, and plausible deniability. That's why today's trafficking, financial laundering, and even EU lobbying ecosystems thrive so comfortably under Belgium's tidy administrative umbrella. Belgium's vulnerability to trafficking and illicit sex economies doesn't come from chaos, it comes from its efficiency, the very trait that made the country a hub of commerce and diplomacy, also made it a corridor for exploitation. Belgium sits at the heart of Western Europe, bordered by the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Luxembourg, and within a few hours' drive of major ports of Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Zeeburg, and airports, Brussels and Ligier. Those logistics corridors that move freight, cash, and labor also move people and illicit media. Traffickers exploit the Schengen area's open borders. Once a person crosses into Belgium, they can be moved invisibly across most of the continental Europe. Well, that makes sense because probably those NATO planes out of Romania, they probably take all of those children and probably unload them in Belgium, right? Well, I'm just making a conclusion here. I don't have any facts to back it up other than logic, right? So Belgium's transport and digital networks are world class. The port of Antwerp alone handles millions of containers each year and has repeatedly been cited as Europol as a key entry point for organized crime, including drug and human trafficking operations. The same intermodal rail and highway systems that feed the EU's industrial heartland make surveillance and interdiction difficult. Online, Belgium's robust data centers and telecom hubs facilitate the hosting or transit of adult content networks that can include coerced or trafficked performers, often routed through Dutch or Luxembourg servers. And then they create all these legal ambiguities. Belgium decriminalized sex work in 2022, intending to improve safety for adults working voluntarily. But that reform created gray zones where coercion can hide behind legality. Law enforcement must now prove exploitation, not merely prostitution, a far harder threshold. At the same time, regional differences like Brussels versus Flanders versus Wallonia mean inconsistent enforcement, and language division slows coordination between agencies. That is another very handy feature, right? Combine that with Schengen's open borders, and Belgium becomes a destination and a transit point, a place where trafficked individuals or illegal digital content can be temporarily washed before being distributed elsewhere in Europe. So essentially, Belgium's geography moves the goods, its infrastructure moves the data, and its law moves the blame. So how do these cases transpire? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about a very important case called the McMartin preschool case, which ends up around these same time frames as these other things were happening. Let me put those on hold for half a second. Well, let me just go ahead and read what I have. I'm very sick, but I'm functioning, so don't worry about that. But anyway, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but let's first talk about Judy Johnson and the McMartin preschool case, and that was in California, 1983 to 1990, right after the whole deal in Belgium, right? Judy Johnson was a 42-year-old mother in Manhattan Beach, California. In August 1983, she went to police with a claim that her 2-year-old son had been sexually abused at his preschool, the McMartin Preschool, one of the most expensive and reputable in the area. Judy's complaint was a spark that launched what became the largest and costliest child abuse trial in U.S. history. She alleged that one of the teachers, Ray Buckley, grandson of the school's founder, had molested her son. As investigators questioned other parents, the stories multiplied. Tunnels under the schools, group rituals, even animal sacrifice, themes that would fuel the so-called satanic panic of the 1980s. The police sent a letter to 200 families asking whether their children had been abused, and that ignited hysteria. The case ballooned into a moral crusade. Hundreds of children were interviewed using highly suggestible techniques. But in the middle of it all, Judy Johnson herself was vilified. Defense lawyers and much of the press painted her as mentally unstable and an alcoholic. She was subjected to relentless public scrutiny, mocked as a paranoid mother who'd imagined the entire thing. In December 1986, before the trial began, Judy was found dead in her home. The coroner attributed it to complications of chronic alcoholism, and her and her credibility was obliterated. Why her story matters. After Judy Johnson's death, the case unraveled. The trials of Ray Buckey and other ended in acquittal or mistrial. But decades later, even skeptical criminologists acknowledged that Judy Johnson had at least some corroborating physical evidence from her son's exam. She had been first to report, then first to be erased. Her death wasn't a glamorous whistleblower martyrdom. It was a slow motion destruction of an ordinary woman crushed by disbelief, stigma, and institutional protection of the powerful. And then right after that, by the mid-1990s, we had the Belgian Dutroux case, 1996 to 2004. And we had all those dead witnesses. In the mid-1990s, Belgium was shaken by the exposure of Marc Dutroux, a convicted child molester and alleged kidnapper, to the disappearance of several young girls. He was arrested in 1996 after 2 victims were found alive in his basement. But what made his case explosive was the belief, supported by multiple investigators, that Dutroux wasn't acting alone and that a network of elites may have protected or enabled him. In the case of Dutroux, at least 12 to 14 individuals connected to the investigation, police officers, witnesses, journalists, and informants, died under mysterious circumstances between 1996 and 2000. Among them, Jean-Paul Dumont, an investigator who pursued links to organized trafficking, was found dead in an alleged suicide. Bernard Weinstein, an associate of Dutroux, allegedly killed by Dutroux himself, but whose body was found in suspicious condition. There was Judge Jean-Marc Cornet, who initially led the investigation and was removed after attending a victim's fundraiser. His removal sparked massive protests known as the White March. Police informants who claimed knowledge of elite parties involving minors later turned up dead or disappeared. A Belgian journalist, Marie-Therese Barat, and later writers including Douglas de Connick and Jean Nichols, documented the trials of deaths in books. So they documented these books, and they said what Belgium was not supposed to know about the Dutroux affairs. Many of the dead either had provided testimony about networks above Dutroux's level or criticized the investigation suddenly narrowing. So what had happened was this one judge went around and he attended some event held by one of the victims, and they were able to use that to toss him out of the case and say that he was formally removed from the investigation. They claimed the reasoning was purely procedural. A judge must maintain not only impartiality but also appearances of impartiality. But to the Belgian public it looked like outrage. The ruling triggered one of the largest public demonstrations in Belgian history. On 20 October 1996, around 300,000 to 400,000 people, roughly 4% of the country's population, marched through Brussels dressed in white, symbolizing innocence and mourning. This became known as the White March. People carried banners reading things like "Justice for our children" and "No confidence in the system." They weren't just protesting the removal of the judge, they were protesting what it symbolized, that the justice system protected the powerful, not the vulnerable. that courageous officials were punished while the case was being smothered, that the one good judge was taken out just as he began probing possible political or elite ties to Dutroux. After the judge's removal, the investigation slowed and narrowed. Leads suggesting connections to a trafficking network were deprioritized. The replacement magistrate, Jacques Landry, was seen as far more cautious. So, the judge that was removed later became Belgium's Supreme Court, but never again took part in a high-profile criminal investigation. For the Belgian public, he became a folk hero, the man who cared too much and was punished for it. I don't know about that. I would be hesitant. He could be part of the whole plot, right? He could be part of the whole plot. I'm not trying to slander the guy. I'm just saying we can't just accept these things as facts, right? And they say that why his removal still matters. It was symbol of a cover-up. To many Belgians, this was a moment the system exposed its own rot. If even empathy for murdered children disqualified a judge, what kind of justice was being protected? The White March marked the beginning of a long crisis of confidence in Belgium's judiciary and police. Surveys show trust levels dropped to historic lows afterward. Afterwards, it was called the Spaghetti Affair, or the Affaire des Spaghetti, because shorthand in Belgium for bureaucratic hypocrisy, punishing decency on a technicality. So they say that the judge's removal wasn't about that he ate spaghetti with that family. It was about a judiciary so obsessed with procedural neutrality. But I don't know. I don't completely buy this whole thing. And I mean no harm. I do not mean any harm to these people. But I just have a suspicion, okay? And how this works is this. The pattern fed a national sense of betrayal. 2/3 of Belgians believed a cover-up existed. So, why do these cases still resonate? Well, when ordinary citizens push against power, they're pathologized or erased. When elites perform victimhood, it's monetized and amplified. And the perfect case in point right now is Candace Owens. With her millions of followers, security, and access, she can safely claim they might kill her, and her audience will rally, buy more merchandise, boost views. Judy Johnson had no such protection. The Belgian whistleblowers had badges and families, but no immunity from institutional fear. The pattern is consistent. Truth tellers die quietly. Performers of danger trend. And Belgium is now the corridor taking porn and trafficking from Netherlands into Europe. So, Judy Johnson complaint was the spark that launched what became the largest and costliest child abuse trial in history. And I think the police did a lot of triggering by sending out those letters. But here's the thing. There's got to come a time when people stand up to the Judy Johnson's deaths and say enough is enough. Stop killing people for being witnesses to crimes. And I'm not saying this just about myself. I'm now dying from lung cancer from what's going on in my own home. But there is a certain apathy towards people like myself. The fear breeds exposure. So people want to ignore people like me. They don't want to talk to us. We become highly isolated. It's not a good deal. It is really, truly baffling to me why it keeps happening. Why do people keep ignoring the true people bringing forth the truth? Why is everybody living in such fear? Well, I think part of the reason is this fear of reincarnation. So, it started with the Belgian Dutroux affair, 1996 to 2004, the dead witnesses. By the mid-1990s, Belgium was shaken by the exposure of Marc Dutroux, a convicted child molester and an alleged kidnapper linked to the disappearance of several girls. So, at least 12 to 14 individuals connected to this investigation. There were police officers, witnesses, journalists, and informants died under mysterious circumstances between 1996 and 2000s. what they had in common, many of the dead had either provided testimony about networks above Dutroux level, or they criticized the investigation suddenly narrowing after the judge was removed. So, and the Belgian court supported removing him from the judgeship. Well, I don't know. They do have rules and laws about how judges should respond, so I'm not really sure that's a hill I want to hop up on and die on. But anyway, but after the judge was removed, of course, things became sketchy, right? For the Belgian public, he became a folk hero, the man who cared too much and was punished for it. Yeah, I don't see it that way. I'm not seeing it that way. And like I said, I will apologize if I got this guy wrong, but something about this guy has my suspicions going. So anyway, both Johnson and the Dutroux witnesses illustrate when ordinary citizens push against power, they're pathologized or erased. When elites perform victimhood, it's monetized and amplified. Candace Owens, with her millions of followers, security, and access, can safely claim they might kill me. And what she did was she sent out these packets to her trusted friends. If they kill me, my friends will tell the whole truth. But what is she doing? She says they're going to kill me. Well, what does that do? Well, that brings up the merchandise, right? It boosts her views. And Judy and these other people had none of that. None of that. So look who you're supporting. You're supporting somebody like Candace Owens, who obviously, quite obviously, is one of the evilest people walking around on social media. That Candace Owens is up to no good, right? So the Dutroux case is one of the darker undercurrents. When Amsterdam began tightening its famous red light zones in the 2010s under both feminist and anti-crime pressure, a migration of capital networks and clients quietly began. The Netherlands started closing windows in Amsterdam's district, revoking licenses, and investigating money laundering through sex venues. Many of those same entrepreneurs and financiers simply shifted south into Belgium, where regulation was lighter, inspections slower, and the stigma lower because the reforms were wrapped in human rights language. So yeah, it just started by all they had to do, and I've already talked about this in the past. So yeah, that is exactly how it got started. They started in 2007. Amsterdam's mayor, this guy started hundreds of brothel windows were closed, dozens of buildings were bought by the city to curb organized crime. Dutch police increased financial crime. Yeah, they pretty much ran them out of the Netherlands, right? So, Belgium's opportunity, the 2010s to the 2022s. Belgium's major cities already had permissive tolerance zones, which made it perfect, right? Antwerp and Brussels were well made and well connected by railway and highway to Dutch hubs, and also, I would say, to NATO, right? All those NATO jets could be flying in children from Romania. Now, to be perfectly clear, I don't know that for a fact, but I do have an imagination, right? So that's how they got rid of the people out of Amsterdam into Belgium. Municipalities value the taxes and tourism, and later Belgium effectively became the easier jurisdictions. Landlords and shell companies registered in Belgium began buying property once owned by Dutch sex industry investors. So money, not morality, got migrated. When Amsterdam tightened, Belgium liberated, and the result was a southward shift in trafficking routes and profit centers. So all the same banks, all the same blind spots. Belgium's reforms were framed as empowerment, so criticism risked being labeled prudish or anti-worker, exactly the rhetoric that shielded traffickers needed. So after Dutroux, Belgium should have become the most vigilant country in Europe about organized sex exploitation. Instead, the trauma drove reform inward into bureaucracy and worker rights language rather than outward toward confronting networks. Meanwhile, the Netherlands' partial retreat from legalized prostitution simply displaced the business one border away. the herd didn't vanish, it migrated. Amsterdam lost windows. Belgium gained corridors. And the children who once marched in white are now grown, watching their country rent those same windows again, this time under a tax code. So what happened right after that? Well, right after that, we had the Presidio and the U.S. military child abuse allegations. At the Presidio Air Base Care Center in San Francisco, parents reported sexual abuse of dozens of children by the Army chaplain Gary Hambright and others. The case mirrored McMartin, reports of ritual abuse, multiple children involved, and institutional denial. The Army chaplain Gary Hambright, was not charged, but the case was dismissed because a U.S. attorney refused to prosecute, citing unreliable child testimony and jurisdiction issues. The Army quietly transferred or retired staff. No convictions followed. After that, in the Mercury News, uncovering that investigative files were destroyed or sealed during base downsizing. So what they did was, after that, was they just went and burned up all the records. They had 2 ritual events at that same place, and they burnt all the records, right? So, yeah, I think these things all connect. How exactly right now, I can't really tell you, but they seem to be a continuum, right? Because right after that, we had the Epstein protected networks, 2005 to 2019. And that's when Palm Beach police opened investigations into Jeffrey Epstein's abuse. And here again, too hot in the kitchen, right? They had to open up that case. And then in 2010 to the 2020s, we had the West Point and military archive fires, and they lost all the data. And then, of course, in 2024, we have the P. Diddy thing, right? And the international news going on with all of that. They all seem to run right back and back to each other, right? 2024 raids recover hard drives, NDAs, and financial ledgers. And they got a few people to flip, but really nobody ever gets charged in any of these things. So from the Presidio-based daycare to West Point's vanished files, from Dutroux sealed archives to Epstein's redacted ledgers, and now to P. Diddy's NDAs, the pattern is constant. Expose, deny, erase, and refame. Each generation thinks it's confronting a new scandal, but it's the same architecture, just digitized. And nobody, I have all the things down below. No convictions of the McMartin case, 2 full trials, all charges ultimately dismissed. The jury was deadlocked on 52 counts. The retrial collapsed. They also lied about those tunnels because they claim that the children were lying about tunnels under their facility, but no, there were tunnels. The tunnels were real. That was all true, but it got buried under this whole trial thing, right? Because the key witness, Judy Johnson, was the initial reporter, was dead before it went to trial. So that discredits some of the investigations. And then, of course, in the Presidio case, this Gary Hambright person, he got indicted on 8 counts of molestation, and federal prosecutors dismissed all charges within months. No military personnel was disciplined or charged afterwards. So essentially, yeah, we had the Dutroux case. Mark Dutroux was charged. His wife was by complicity, and some others, a couple of other people got charged, but Dutroux convicted on all major counts, sentenced to life imprisonment. In the McMartin case, they're released on 2012 on parole. Yeah, everybody got off the hook. I have all the details down below if you take a look at it. So, and then, of course, an Epstein case, that went on from 2000 to 2010, delays, deaths, and then we had P. Diddy right after that. I think these are all orchestrated effects, but I can't prove anything right now, but I can tell you this. I have a whole show I've done about the Department of Defense that I'll be back with. The Department of Defense is running daycare centers all over the world, and I believe it is still going on right this minute. So, yeah, it all connects. Everybody thought that Belgium was about delicious chocolates. Turns out the center isn't a cherry, but a dark way of doing business, emerging from the money to the trafficking, and a real hub indeed. So, underneath is a centuries-old hub for hidden wealth, military logistics, and human trafficking is what we find right there in Belgium. And right there at that big trade route, and they have 80% of the world's rough diamonds coming through there, extreme secrecy, everything you'd ever want to know about what's going on there. And yeah, I missed a big one when I was talking about the last move of this funds. I don't know how I missed this one. I think I was so focused on Amsterdam that I kind of lost my mind for a little bit there, and I took my eyes off of Belgium. So Antwerp's port is a global container hub. Billions in goods, only a fraction are inspected. Cocaine seizures there are now among the highest in Europe, but traffickers adept by embedding a cargo in legitimate shipments. The same logistics companies handle everything from industrial chemicals to medical equipment, giving perfect cover for human and digital trafficking networks, including encrypted communications and porn distribution. So yeah, that is how it ended up all in Belgium. And that there is something about this trafficking, and I will be back with much more about that. Um, so Belgium sells itself on an image of chocolate, diamonds, EU civility, velvet smooth diplomacy. It's a postcard Europe sends abroad. But when you pull back the glossy ribbon, the same geography, infrastructure, and institutional complexity that made Belgium a diplomatic and commercial crossroads also make it an exceptionally efficient corridor for darker flows, people, illicit money, and services that the public would rather not see. That paradox, charm on the surface, conduit underneath, is the clearest and most unnerving lesson of recent decades. Belgium sits in the middle of the continent with no natural barriers, a patchwork of highways, rail links, airports, and seaports that put Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Paris, and London a few hours away. In logistic terms, that is a virtue: rapid delivery, flexible routing, easy consolidation. For trafficking networks and money movers, it's the same virtue turned inside out. Cargo that looks legitimate on paper can move through a maze of terminals and municipal judiciaries with minimal delay. Human flows follow the same tracks. Antwerp's century-long role in the diamond trade is instructive. The industry historically relied on a dense web of intermediaries, cash transactions, and rapid cross-border shipments, all elements that create opacity. High value, small volume goods are perfect laundering vectors. Hide illegal procedures in diamond trades, move them through private banking and trust structures, then disappear into legitimate commerce. Where an industry thrives on discretion and speed, bad actors can piggyback without changing the outward shape of business. Fragmented governance, centralized opportunities. Belgium's federal structure with separate authorities for Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels creates enforcement blind spots. While one jurisdiction treats strictly, another may tolerate as a harm reduction measure. That fragmentation is easily gamed. Agencies pass responsibility, cases get slowed by jurisdictional wrangling, and traffickers exploit inconsistency. The legal decision to decriminalize sex work and frame it as a labor right widened the room for legal defenses. Now traffickers can claim management or employment and force investigators to prove coercion beyond reasonable doubts. While the Amsterdam and other Dutch municipalities began reducing a visible window prostitution and tightening regulation, activities didn't evaporate, it migrated. Belgium's tolerance zones and later regulatory choices created an attractive alternative. Markets follow friction. When a formally legal, visible market is suppressed in one place, and remains administrative lighter in another, capital, property owners, and criminal networks flow to the path of least resistance. Antwerp is one of Europe's largest container hubs. The vast majority of global trade moves in sealed containers. Only a fraction is physically inspected. Criminal networks exploit that ratio, embedding contraband or facilitating human movement in legal shipments, or hiding revenue by mixing it in with legitimate trade flows. The same port infrastructure that provides healthy European commerce also underwrites black market logistics. Brussels is Europe's political brain. The EU institutions, NATO headquarters, and a myriad of embassies, NGOs, and private sector data centers cluster there. Those institutions bring diplomatic protections, special legal arrangements, and significant private infrastructure. That combination creates areas of practical sovereignty and complexity. Cables, data routing, and server farms that handle massive cross-border traffic enjoy protections and arrangements foreign to most municipal regulators. If illicit content or services hide in privately hosted nodes or transit through diplomatic channels, tracing and accountability become exponentially harder. That is why the presence of NATO headquarters and allied facilities raises more than the normal number of eyebrows in any serious probe of transnational networks. Not because NATO is implicated, but because institutional privilege and security layers complicate forensic work and public oversight. What makes Belgium's role particularly insidious is how unthreatening it looks. A diplomat sipping coffee between meetings, a chocolatier repackaging truffles, the city of Antwerp's historic quay. They provide a social camouflage. The respectable industries get plausibility to financial movements, and the cultural brand makes allegations feel surreal to the average consumer. It's an old pattern. The polite veneer of normal commerce is the perfect cover for systematic leakage. Marc Dutroux's case did more than horrify Belgium. It broke the public's faith in institutions. The crisis produced reforms, but also a kind of institutional timidity. Officials anxious to avoid accusations of incompetence or conspiracy sometimes opted for sealed files and cautious bureaucratic responses instead of full-throated aggressive investigations. When the public's confidence evaporates, so does political will, and that vacuum is the clearest haven for networks that trade in human misery. Routes and relationships stretch beyond Belgium's borders. Balkan and Eastern European transit corridors, Romania and others included, have historically been implicated in smuggling and trafficking patterns. NATO's operational presence and military logistics intersect awkwardly with these realities. Military infrastructure and private logistic capacity can, unintentionally, provide routes and resources that organized networks repurpose. That overlap doesn't prove malfeasance. It does, though, complicate oversight and demand rigorous independent audits whenever sensitive flows are investigated. Belgian chocolates will still taste like chocolate, but the image of Belgium as only sweetness is incomplete. The attractiveness of its cultural brand makes it easier for illicit spaces to hide. Wealth management, affluent tourism, multinational institutions, and a permissive legal frame all contribute to produce frictionless lanes where bad actors can operate. If you value the idea of Europe as a place of rule and law and humane governance, understanding the logistics of how illicit markets adapt is the first step towards fixing them. Yeah, if anybody wants to fix them, right? So, this is really a call for scrutiny, not paranoia. This is not an argument for blank suspicion of Belgium, NATO, or continental trade. It's an argument for focused forensic transparency. coordinated cross-border policing that respects civil liberties. Yeah, Belgium's centrality, geography, economic, diplomacy is what makes it both invisible and vulnerable. That duality should prompt vigilance, not cynicism. When a place can hide a corridor in plain sight, the duty of civil society and accountability institutions is to light it up. So, they all got this started, and I'm going to be closing off this file. I kind of think, at least I get the picture. I don't know, do you get the picture? It looks to me like the herd had spread into Malta, Ireland, and maybe other jurisdictions where oversight is weak or regulatory arbitrage is possible. But Belgium stands out not as one among many, but as a major nexus. In that sense, the shift isn't far away from Belgium. It's through Belgium and centralized there, while peripheral jurisdictions play supporting roles in registration, hosting, envelopment, and temporary staging. And yes, all there out of that country that people think of having delicious chocolates, right? And I'll be back with more about how this connects with all this child sex abuse and all this stuff. Too big a topic for me to get more involved in today. I'm going to bid you goodbye. Be safe out there, and goodbye for now. And I will return. I have much more to say about these data centers. These data centers going on right now, 100% a pump and dump. There, I said it. And these data centers are likely what's going to bring down the entire economy of the entire world. Yeah, just those data centers. So be safe out there, and goodbye for now.